Hello, my name is Michael Orts and I'm a Photoshop quality engineer for Adobe. I'm going to be giving a technical overview of the Blur Gallery feature new to Photoshop CS6. The Blur Gallery feature combines blur filtering with pixel masking to allow for creative blur effects inside of a convenient, on-canvas, module-based user interface. Blur Gallery is compatible with all bit depths, 8, 16, and 32 bits per channel, and is also available for RGB, CMYK, grayscale, and lab color modes. Blur Gallery will work on locked background layers and is also compatible with unlocked promoted layers. Blur Gallery is not available for smart object layers. It can be applied to text layers, but they have to be rasterized first. Blur Gallery only affects pixel data. It's not available to apply directly to layer mask or alpha channels, and if you enter Blur Gallery with a layer mask, it will ignore the mask and apply the effect to the entire image. However, if you enter with a selection, it will recognize the selection and affect only the selected area by going to Filter, Blur, and then choosing one of the 3 Blur Gallery module effects. Each menu choice leads to the same Blur Gallery task space. This just affects what module you start out in, and you can access the other effects once you're inside. Let's start with Field Blur. Field Blur works by allowing you to place multiple pins of different blur amounts onto an image. These pins then act as anchor points to generate a gradient field of blur amounts which go across the entire image. You can even adjust the blur amount to 0 for areas that you don't want to have any blur. If we hold down the M key on the keyboard, we can see a grayscale representation of this field of blur amounts. Black indicates no blur and white indicates maximum blur. The controls for field blur are very simple. You can select an individual pin and then adjust the blur amount by using the slider on the right side of the panel. Or you can click, hold, and drag the blur ring for each individual pin to adjust the blur amount. Click anywhere on the image to add a new pin, and if you'd like to delete a pin, just select the pin and hit the delete key. If you'd like to delete all of the pins, then click the Remove All Pins button located at the top of the screen in the options bar. Note that if you have a stacked effect from applying multiple modules, that this will delete the pins from every module. Before we move on to the next effect, I'd like to point out the individual effect on-off checkboxes located next to each module. So let's apply another blur. Okay, and we can check the checkbox here to turn off the effect for individual modules. In this case, we want to turn the field blur effect on and off. This is different from the preview, which will toggle on and off the global effect of everything that's being done in Blur Gallery. It's also different from the preview in the sense that if you turn the preview off and hit the OK button, it will still render whatever effects that you have, even if you can't see them. If you toggle these effect boxes on and off, it will actually take this effect out of the final rendered output once you hit the OK button. Now let's move on to the iris blur effect. We'll just click on the name or the arrow to switch to the iris blur module. Iris blur creates a circle of unblurred image area and then blurs everything else in the image around it. Like field blur, you can add more than one iris pin to the image. And note that in Blur Gallery and all the modules, if you move a pin off of the image area, it will still take it into account and you can still see that effect on the image even though the center of the pin is moved off canvas. Unlike field blur, the iris blur pin contains special controls to adjust its iris shape. Click and drag part of the outer ring here to adjust the overall size of the pin. Click and drag an ellipse pin to change the shape of the iris into an ellipse, and you can also rotate the iris. Click and drag the square to make the iris more rectangular in its shape. These 4 points are called the feather points. You can click and drag these points to adjust the gradation of blur in the iris between the unblurred area and the blurred area. You can also hold down the Alt key plus click and drag to move the feather points individually. And to temporarily hide the on-canvas pin interface so that you can see your blur effects more, just hold down the H key on the keyboard.